Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Transitions. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a research fellow at the East West Center, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here moderating today's event. For today's session, we have a presentation from Dr. Tammy Tabe. Tammy is an Oceania Research Fellow at the East West Center. Prior to this, she was a lecturer at the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of South Pacific. She is a Solomon Islander of Kiribati and Tuvaluan descent. She works widely in the Pacific Islands on areas such as marine protected areas, community and ecosystem-based adaptation, gender inequality, historical relocation and displacement of Pacific Island people, identity and diaspora, and climate change-induced migration and displacement. In her presentation today, Tammy will talk about two aspects of her work. First, the engineering of Gilbertese relocation to the Solomon Islands. Second, how Gilbertese, despite being uprooted from their home islands, used the land given to them in the Solomon Islands to reconstruct the place they now call home. And lastly, how this may inform conversations of displacement and continuity for Pacific communities that may be subject to climate-induced migration and displacement in the future. In terms of logistics, Tammy's presentation will be roughly 40 minutes long. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. If you would like to ask Tammy a question, feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box down below, and we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. Without further ado, I will stop the introduction here and over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Ponwin, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all of you who are viewing in and linking in online. Aloha kako, alo olgeta, and kamna maori. First of all, I would like to just really offer my thanks to the people of this land to which I have come to reside and also to pursue my career. The land in which has enabled me, particularly today, to share stories of my people as well as stories from the Pacific Islands. Aloha. So my presentation will be focused on stories from the Gilbertese people in the Solomon Islands, and also people that I have worked with over the years. Many of you who have worked alongside me or whom I have worked alongside over the years know my research work, and you also know the stories of the Gilbertese people that I have shared through my work, as well as through stories that we share when it comes to climate change, relocation, as well as displacement conversations. So I want to start by just giving a brief context to the study and the research that I have been doing. And I've been so honored to be doing this research because it's not only research that forms part of my work today, but it's also stories of people that I'm part of, the community that I'm part of, stories from my grandparents as well as elders that have entrusted me over the years to be the voice to the world and to be able to share their stories in the way that they expect. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity and to be trusted as well for that purpose. So today I'm going to be talking about the Gilbertese relocation. And as Ponwin mentioned, my presentation, my conversation today is going to be in two parts. The first one we'll talk about, and very briefly, just to give the context, because it can take up a lot of time just talking about the relocation of the Gilbertese from the Gilbert Islands to the Solomon Islands. So I just want to provide a context to the study so that it kind of helps those that have not heard about my work or still needs to understand what I'm doing, have some idea to what I'm talking about. And so my presentation, the first part of my presentation, this conversation focuses on the Gilbertese relocation from the Gilbert Islands to Phoenix Island. So during the colonial period, the Ellice and Gilbert Islands, today the Gilbert Islands is now called Kiribati, and then the Ellice Islands is now called Tuvalu. So they were first discovered by the British naval officers between the years 1764 and 1824. So as we all know, during the colonial period, when captains discover a group of islands, they name the islands after themselves. So Captain Gilbert discovered the group of these islands in the Gilbert, so he called the islands after himself. So they're called Gilbert Islands. In 1892, both Ellice and the Gilbert Islands were declared a British protectorate. In the 1900, Ocean Island, Banaba, was included as part of the Gilbert and Ellice protectorate. And in 1960, the Gilbert and Ellice protectorate became a colony. So that's how the Gilbert and Ellice colony became British colony. So now I'm going to talk about the first migration from the Southern Gilbert Islands. So during the time in which British administration colonized the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, they came in, and in their attempt of administering those group of islands, they attempted to reorganize the communities as well as islands in a way that it'll be easy to administer as a colonial administration. So the first thing they did was stock take of the population in the islands. And then after, they came up with this new land code registration system to which landowners need to register their lands. And so in the Gilbert Islands, land is owned across different islands, and you don't have to have extensive land. Fragments of land are given in exchange for favors as well as gifts. So there is this understanding of land ownership to which is quite different from the way the Western sees how land is managed and registered. So when they came up with that new land registration system, it actually secluded a lot of the families that had lands across the islands, but were considered at the time as those lacking land. So at the end of that reorganization of the villages and communities, the British Colonial Administration decided that, there's a group of people that are landless, that do not have enough land to support themselves. And it also considered the Gilbert Islands overpopulated. So with overpopulation and the lack of land and resources, one of the things that it came up with is the need to relocate this additional population in the Gilbert Islands somewhere else within the colony so that they may have access to adequate land as well as an opportunity to improve their standard of living. And so this idea of relocating from the Gilbert Islands, specifically the Southern Gilbert Islands, and I would ask for the first map to be put up, just to give people an idea of the islands in which I'm referring to. So if you look at Kiribati, the map now, you can see Tara and Kiribati. So the southern part of Kiribati is where most of the populations, these additional populations, were relocated from, and they were relocated to Phoenix Islands. At the time, families were required to apply for relocation. So while most of them did not want to be relocated, they were promised and they were guaranteed that with the relocation from the Gilbert Islands to the Phoenix Islands, they'll have a better future. And so a lot of the families agreed to be relocated, but also with the basis that the Phoenix Islands is very similar to the Gilbert Islands in terms of its environment, in terms of the changes that they need to face. So there would, because it's still within the colony, the changes that they're likely to experience would be very minimal compared to being relocated elsewhere. So a lot of the families agreed to be moved to Phoenix Islands. And one of the things that really drove them to move is they were promised adequate land. So a lot of them, while understanding that they may have limited land in the Gilbert Islands, the offer that they will have access to adequate land in the Phoenix Islands actually allowed them to agree to being relocated to the Phoenix Islands. So a lot of them moved to the Phoenix Islands. And so you have Nukumaroro, Orona, and Mandra, three of the islands that were inhabited by the settlers that came from the northern, not from the northern, but from the southern Gilbert Islands. And so they settled in Phoenix Island. So it was around late 1930s that this group of families were relocated. So between 1939 and 1940, a total of almost 800 people were relocated from the Southern Gilbert Islands to the Phoenix Islands, where they lived for a couple of years. Now, a lot of the changes that they encountered were not drastic because the islands were still atolls, the climate was still the same, the environment was still the same, people were still living on atoll islands, and therefore access to marine resources was similar to those experience, to access experience in the Southern Gilbert Islands. It was not until the mid 1950s when relocation, the second relocation had to occur. And so now they were relocated from the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands. And just to give a bit of context to that, to the second relocation, during the World War II, Tarawa, especially the Kiribati Gilbert Islands, were heavily affected by World War II. So in the aftermath of the war, a lot of the coconut plantations that were on the islands were destroyed. And so it really affected copper production and the revenue that the British Colonial Administration was generating from this coconut plantations. At the time, you can see that Phoenix Islands on this map is quite isolated from the main Tarawa, from the main group of islands. And so during that time, Phoenix Islands, during the war, Phoenix Islands was completely in isolation from Tarawa and as well as from the outside world. And then following the war, a lot of the Phoenix Island population started experiencing extreme drought periods. And at the time, they were also in need of relief assistance from the main headquarters in Tarawa. And so during that time, after the war, the colonial administration has to also take care of the population in the Phoenix Islands. So in order to do that, they had to transport relief aid, so in terms of water, of food to the islands. And the transportation of this relief supplies was costly, and what it was going to cost a lot in the coming years for the British Colonial Administration. And so with a couple of times that they supply the Phoenix Islands population, the British Colonial Administration realized that for it to continue to supply relief assistance to the population of the Phoenix Islands, it's going to cost more for it, and therefore will accumulate a lot of economic expenses. And because at the time, they were not generating a lot of revenue to offset this cost from the copper production, they think that the Phoenix Islands, the continuous support of population on the Phoenix Islands will eventually become an economic liability. And so they were looking for solutions. But during that time also, the islands were going through a period of severe droughts. And it's really hard to really confirm this because research into archives did not really show evidence that the islands were extremely at drought, going through drought. So, but at the time, based on the colonial documentation of what happened in the Phoenix Islands, is at that time, the islands were going through extreme severe drought. And so the population of Manra in the Phoenix Islands was the first group of people that actually asked for assistance from the colonial administration to be relocated elsewhere. Now, their request was for them to be relocated elsewhere within the colony. And they suggested Christmas Island at the time because it's one of the largest atolls, and they see that they could thrive there as a community. But then the colonial administration has other plans. Now, during that time, the Manra population had gone through what they described in the colonial records as environmental degradation. So there was lack of coconuts, the water the fresh water was no longer accessible and available to the people on Manra. So during that time, the colonial administration was starting to look into other colonies and territories with hope that it will be able to export the Gilbertese people as laborers. In exchange, they will be able to settle in these colonies and territories. And at the time, labor recruitment was very big during that period of time. And so that was one of their options that the colonial administration had in order to resolve the issue. But then a lot of these colonies and territories the request or the request for labor exploitation in these colonies and territories did not come through. And many refused the recruitment of the Gilbertese people because they could recruit them as laborers, but they are not guaranteed to give them a place to settle in their territories and colonies. And there were other reasons as well to which Gilbertese were not considered as the most favored laborers at the time. And so the British Colonial Administration has to look at other options now within the Pacific region. And so while it considered other places, there were still restrictions in terms of exporting this Gilbertese people as laborers. And at that time, the Solomon Islands was a British protectorate. And after the war, a lot of Solomon Islands has a lot of coconut plantations. And after the war, a lot of the laborers that were expected to work in these plantations have returned to their home islands. And so the British Colonial Administration considered that, with the depopulation in the Solomon Islands and with the overpopulation in the Gilbert Islands, I have control over this group of islands. I should just bring the Gilbertese people across to the Solomon Islands so they can be a source of labor to these plantations, as well as while they work the plantation, they can eventually become residents of Solomon Islands. But then they realized that the Gilbertese people are not used to working the land. They come from atoll islands, and therefore that poses another challenge. But the British Colonial Administration was very insistent that the sooner it relocates the Gilbertese people from the Phoenix Islands, the sooner it will get rid of its economic liability and curb the economic expenses. And at the same time, the Gilbertese people were promised a good future in the Solomon Islands with more access to land. And so that's when the relocation from the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands began. So there were two different waves of relocation. So the first group of Gilbertese that were relocated to the Solomon Islands came from Mandra. If you can see on the Phoenix Islands group of islands, Mandra was one of the islands that was settled by the Gilbertese. So they came from Mandra, and then this group of people settled on what we call Sisiana or Titiana. In the Gizo area, on Gizo Island in the Western Province. And so this first relocation was considered somewhat planned, but also there was a lot of preparations that was put towards this relocation. And so there was a group of Gilbertese elders that were taken to the Solomon Islands to try and identify a location in which they can settle, one that is close to the fringing reef because they're very dependent on marine resources, but one that is also not so far from administrative stations so that they can get assistance whenever they need. So that's why the people chose Sisiana or Titiana on Gizo Islands. So that was the first relocation. Now, the second relocation was from Orona and Nukumarara, and this was done more so without being properly planned. So there was a lack of preparation. People were not really prepared to move, but then the relocation has to occur because the colonial administration saw that there was additional land after the population of Mandra has settled in the Solomon Islands and thought, maybe I could relocate the entire Phoenix Islands population to the Solomon Islands. In that way, we don't have to supply any more relief to the Phoenix Islands, and in that way, people will have access to more land and perhaps build a better future when they get relocated to the Solomon Islands. And so I'm just going to ask for the next map to be reflected. So this is the history of the relocation of the Gilbertese people, and just providing a context to the two relocations and how they ended up in the Solomon Islands. Now, I mentioned previously that there were two waves, and one of them settled Sisiana on Gizo Island, and the second wave of relocation got people to settle on Wagina Island. So if we can go to the third map to reflect that. Yeah, so Wagina. And so while I work on both communities, when I was doing my research in the Solomon Islands, I focused mainly on the population on Wagina Island. And this is because I come from Wagina Island. My grandparents were resettled to Wagina Island. And so there was sort of like, there was more of relationship. And I think because it was my space and it's where I grew up, I was able to converse more with the people that were part of the relocation. And so I wanted to focus for this conversation. I really wanted to focus on conversations that I've had with people on Wagina Island. Now, I provided a context to the relocation of the Gilbert Islands to the Solomon Islands, and with any relocation that we consider before, whether they were administered under colonial administration, or even now when we're talking about climate change, displacement, and relocation between islands in the same territory is challenging. But there's more challenges when you relocate beyond your national jurisdiction. And during my work on Wagina Island, conversations around migration or how the Gilbertese got to the Solomon Islands was something that we never really talk about. It was kind of like a can of worms that you don't want to open. But I'm very fortunate. I'm really blessed that this work was pursued while I was here in Hawaii as part of ISWA Center graduate studies. I was able to be encouraged to document this history by one of my professors, actually by a group of professors from the Pacific Island Center for Pacific Island Studies at UH Manor. So I'm really fortunate for that opportunity and what they saw in me doing this work. So while talking to people on Wagina, there were different conversations around their relocation to the Solomon Islands. Now, prior to going to Wagina or to the Solomon Islands to visit these communities, I had gone through archival materials in the Western Pacific Archives and go over documentations of the relocation. Now, the relocation was documented in a way that it was a humanitarian intervention. And so the British Colonial Administration saw that the people could no longer live on these islands because of severe droughts, so they had to be relocated. However, from the people, they saw that they were being uprooted without any agency and relocated to a foreign land in which they were expected to thrive as a community. And so it was very heartbreaking talking to these people because a lot of them lost their voice during the relocation. And a lot of them don't talk about these relocations because they feel like they shouldn't talk about it. It's not something to be talked about. And so while talking with them, they expressed their grievances towards the British Colonial Administration for relocating them to a foreign land. But also towards the end of the conversation, a lot of them also mentioned that they have been so privileged and fortunate that they could come to the Solomon Islands and now their kids are enjoying life as part of the Solomon Islands wider community. And so during the conversations with them, a lot of them talked about the challenges in which they had to face arriving on the island of Wagina. And because they came from Atoll Islands, Wagina was a completely new environment. But despite all these challenges, one of the things that they talked about was the ability to be able to reestablish something that's similar and reflects their home islands. So the first thing was being given land. Now the land on Wagina still remained disputed up to this day, but they were allocated slots according to the families. And so with this land and with the demarcation of the villages across the island, these people were able to reestablish what is similar or more so to their home islands in the Phoenix Islands. And so the first thing that they did was, after the land allocation to families, is the naming of the villages. And so if you can see from the previous map, it shows Nikumaroro, Mandra, and Orona. So because I'm talking about Wagina, two of the villages that were named after was Nikomaroro and Orona, which is now called Arariki, and that's where I come from. And then you have the other island as Cooksin, which is an extended part of the group of people that were relocated to the island. And so what they did was naming the villages. Now, naming the villages allowed them to feel that, okay, so this is our new community in a foreign land, but at the same time, it allows them to start using social capital. They were able to establish the maniape, which is very traditionally important to any Kiribati or Gilbertese community. And with the establishment of the maniape, people were able to organize themselves around this building. And this building is very essential in terms of a Gilbertese village, the way the Gilbertese or a Kiribati village is organized, but also in terms of the governance system in which these people observe and practice in their home islands. So this is one of the essential things that they established before organizing houses and the people around it. And so up to this day, we still have maniapes, we still have people, a lot of the cultural relationships as well as cultures, traditions, and languages were still observed right from the beginning of the resettlement of Wagina up until today. I grew up in that environment, and while there's a lot of arguments that, oh, this is not our land, a lot of the elders during conversations with them on the island have said, this is now our home. And so with that articulation, it helps young people like me and the other generations, younger generations, to try and ground ourselves that although we were not part of the land or being grounded in the land in the Phoenix Islands and the Gilbert Islands, we can now ground ourselves in this new space and this new place. And so I wanted to go back. We can do away with the maps now. I wanted to go back on the abstract of my presentation conversation and really relook at conversations and discourses around climate change, migration, and displacement today. A lot of the conversation always focus on land. And if we can reflect back on the Gilbertese relocation history, land was the fundamental reason for their relocation and displacement. They were able to relocate from the Gilbert Islands to the Phoenix Islands because they were offered land. And then again, they were able to relocate from the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands because they were offered more land and a better future. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this case, and not only the Gilbertese relocation, but there are also other Pacific Island communities that have been relocated, have been displaced as well during the colonial period that we can also learn from in terms of informing conversations around climate change, migration, and displacement today. And so with the Gilbertese, land was very fundamental. And when we look in the Pacific today or elsewhere in the world where land is essential, Pacific Islanders, we need land to remain grounded. We need land to be able to nurture our cultures that define us as a people, but also define us uniquely as different Pacific Islanders. And so land is perceived, is embodied differently across the region, and in different Pacific Island countries as well as communities. Now, for the Gilbertese Islands people, land was really important. Land was very, very important when they were in the Gilbert Islands. It's something that people fight over, but it's also something that's given as a gift in exchange for a favor. And so land was also something that also brought them to the Solomon Islands. And if you look back through the history and just the conversation that we have just now in terms of their relocation, land plays a fundamental reason for Pacific Islands mobility, and not only being displaced and being relocated for various colonial reasons, but if you look into the history of the Pacific Islands, a lot of the Pacific Island communities migrate or they move between islands also in search of land. And with that comes our identity as mobile people. with the Gilbertese people, they were able to relocate to the Solomon Islands and reconstruct their home, and using what I call social capital. And social capital is what they have embodied as a people in their previous homes. So you have cultures, you have languages, you have relationships, and these are the things that are fundamentally nurtured by being grounded in land. And so if we come back to conversations around loss of land, being displaced as a result of climate change impacts, being relocated because that's the only solution to perhaps specific island communities that are extremely affected by climate change impacts, and also sea level rise. How do we embody all of this if we have to lose our lands? Conversations that have been occurring right now in the climate change space have been on land. A lot of the Pacific Island countries, and including me, I've worked in this space, have been advocating that we do not want to leave our lands. We want to continue to remain in our islands. We want to continue to thrive. But how do we navigate beyond these conversations, and while seeing land as a form of resistance and a fight towards the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as resistance towards the being pushed to leave? How can we navigate beyond this and say land is also something that we embody as Pacific Islanders? And then to be able to move beyond our home islands, to be able to be mobile, is also what defines us as Pacific Islanders. And I'm sorry, I'm referring mostly here to Pacific Islanders who might be working in this space, who have engaged in this space. And so I apologize if I'm making a lot of reference to Pacific Island scholars and people that have worked, but also to people who have worked in the Pacific on climate change impacts, climate change, migration, and displacement. How do we navigate beyond conversations of just, grounding ourselves in land, we don't want to move because this is our home, to looking at mobility as a form of resilience? And this conversation looking beyond that, and it's not to dismiss the fact that land is essential for Pacific Islands people, and that we need to be grounded and to continue to remain grounded and to continue to thrive in our island homes. But how do we go beyond that and start talking about what if we leave? What if we move away? What are some of the things that we can do to continue to be resilient as Pacific Islanders? And how can we start integrating this kind of conversations when we talk about climate change, migration, and displacement? And, conversations around mobility or relocation are often seen as that's the last option. Pacific Island people, or those that are affected by climate change impacts and sea level rise, do no longer have a choice, but they have to leave. And that's wrong, because people are continuously fighting for their land to remain on it and continue to thrive. But I think we need to shift our attention to seeing that being able to mobile is also a form of resilience, of Pacific Islands being able to establish themselves across the globe, across place, across space. Pacific Islanders in this context are never displaced. And I know that the physical sense of it, the conversations around being relocated, brings out, a lens that we are displaced. Pacific Island people are displaced. But if you look at it today, when we travel elsewhere, we're always connected to somebody who's from the region that lives there. And so I just want to bring it back to conversations to the history of the Gilbertese people, as well as acknowledging other communities in the Pacific that have also been displaced and relocated as a result of mining, as well as nuclear testing. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from that? And not only in terms of them being displaced and relocated, but also how are they doing in their new homes? How are they thriving? We have a lot of diaspora communities across the globe. A lot of them are doing very well. And I'm saying this very well, but still they face challenges. But how are they navigating these challenges? And I think this is some of the conversations when we look at climate change, migration, and displacement dialogues, these are some of the important conversations that we should start talking about. And specifically, I'm referring to the Pacific audience on these conversations. So with that, I'll stop. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tammy, for the very informative and interesting presentation. The audience has lots of questions for you. And the first question is, did you find any correspondence or writing from the colonial administrators that explain their viewpoint or state of mind for making their decisions about the colonized people?
Sorry, Ponwin, can you repeat that question again, please?
Yes. Did you find any correspondence or writing from the colonial administrators that explain their viewpoint or state of mind for making the decisions about the colonized people?
So there were telegram exchange between the colonial administrators and officers regarding the whole sort of orchestration or engineering of the Gilbertese relocation. A lot of it is trying to solve a problem that they say they have created and that the Gilbertese themselves can't resolve. And so by relocating them is a solution to that particular issue. A lot of the writings are not explicit. I have not really gained access to telegrams that actually outline this is why we want them to move there. But usually, but for the purpose of the research that I've done with the archival materials, a lot of them was to resolve land issues, overpopulation in the islands, and then from the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands was more as a form of humanitarian, without really saying that they wanted to sort of like get rid of accumulating economic expenses by continually supplying relief aid to the Phoenix Islands. And so I think in that context, it also challenges my position as somebody who's an insider, but also an outsider, and sort of frame, okay, how are they thinking? And how are they making decisions based on how they see the people? And so that was one of the things as well that I had to consider while doing the research.
Okay, the second question is also related to archival material. And the question is, did you come across any type of thoughts or feeling about the relocated people? Did you find any evidence on that, and what were they?
Sorry, the thoughts on?
Yeah, related to the question about the primary contemporary sources that reflect on thoughts and feeling of the relocated people. Did you come across any of that?
So the archival materials does not contain any thoughts or feelings about the Gilbertese people, or even their response towards decisions made for them to relocate. I think at the time they were just taking orders with respect to the authorities. And so a lot of the materials extracted from the archives only tell one story. And so it was my responsibility to bring in the people's side of the story and really try and understand conversations or the history of the relocation.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we're moving away from the archival material, focusing now on potential conflicts between people who have migrated and people and they're in their destination islands. So the question is, have there been actual conflict between the atoll people and those on the mainland or the receiving party? The audience is interested in knowing ways in which this group of people managed to minimize conflict using the traditional way, such as mediation or dialogue. Is this something you have seen happen, or is there independent Western law or system that deal with conflict?
Thank you. I think when we talk about conflict in the Pacific Islands, often the Western system of resolving conflicts does not really work for Pacific Island communities. And in the case of the Gilbertese people on Wagina, there was a lot of land issues, and there were disputes over the fact that they have settled Wagina Island, which belongs to traditionally the Choiseul people, without the government at the time, the colonial government or protectorate government at the time, did not even get their consent for the island to be settled. And so there were ongoing conflicts. And when I say conflicts, it was just disputes over the true ownership of the island. And so it puts the Gilbertese people, kind of like it threatens them to be able to thrive, because they fear that they might have to be moved again because they did not understand who has complete right over the island. But as the years go by, one of the approaches that they did in order to address this was to bring in the elders from the Wagina Island and the traditional landowners and try and have a conversation over the settlement of the island. And with that, they also establish boundaries in terms of respect. So when you talk about access to resources, both on land and marine, there were some sort of like rules that say, okay, both people from both communities can access resources on Wagina in terms of trees, but they can also access resources like in the marine resources as well when they have to fish or go diving. And so that's one of the understanding that that the Wagina people have in relation to settling on the island, but also having access to the resources. And over time, they started building relationships through integration, but also through coming together and talking about the common issues that they face.
Got it. Thank you. Next question focuses on changes in cultural traditions, focusing on land. So the question is, how did or does the change in land ownership with the relocated Gilbertese communities affect other land-based cultural traditions, especially in the area of authority and social or leadership titles? How did the relocated Gilbertese address that?
So because of the difference in the land tenureship in the Gilbert Islands and in the Phoenix Islands, and then now they were relocated to the Solomon Islands, a lot of them did not understand the way in which land is owned and managed in the Solomon Islands. And so the land plots that were allocated to them when they first arrived on the island is the same land plot in which the families still reside on. And so over the years, with the growing population, a lot of the families have moved out of the island, away from the island in search of more land. And so I believe in the beginning when they were allocated land, there was this understanding that that land is owned by them for eternity, in which they can pass on to their children. But that's very different, especially when Solomon Islands gained independence. And I do not have deep insights into land ownership and land ownership in the Solomon Islands, and especially in Wagina. I have a colleague and a good friend who actually has done a lot of work on this, Dr. Joseph Okona, and he'll be able to speak more about the land management as well, tenureship between the Gilbertese Islands and the rest of the Solomon Islands. But that understanding resides among the Gilbertese people on Wagina, that this land is ours, and although how small it is, we'll just rotate it within the family. But in terms of land ownership being reflected in the land registry, that's another question. And it's something that they're still trying to navigate.
Got it, thank you. Another question related to that is, do the Gilbertese have a spiritual or an ancestral relationship with the land, or has that been diminished by the colonial practice?
In terms of Wagina Island, of course, it's a foreign island. But what I was saying in my talk was, the use of social capital. People came with things. People came not only with the languages and traditions from their previous homes, but they came with an embodiment of their land, but also there's this spiritual elements that they brought together to the land. And I know that in that context, land, because it's a foreign land, they were not able to use land in relation to spiritual elements that they bring to the land as compared to the Phoenix Islands, the Gilbert Islands, but they were still able to practice a lot of the spiritual elements, a lot of these cultural elements in relation to the land in which they settle. And this is because I'm saying maybe this is because they feel and they think that that is their land given to them in exchange of the one in which they gave up back at their home. And so they have some sense of ownership over it, to which they can observe and practice cultural elements that they embody when they arrived on the island. But that's an area that I haven't really gone into.
Okay, got it. Thank you. We're going to move away from the land ownership topic, and now we're going into a question about resilience, focusing on migration. So the question is, could you elaborate more about your last point, focusing on mobility as resilience? How would you respond to the contention that their resilience play out in the landscape of shrinking choices?
Sorry, I missed out on the last part of the question.
Yes. How would you respond to the contention that their resilience plays out in a landscape of shrinking choices?
I think that's a very important question. And I think it's also one that we need to also talk about and unpack, especially for people and Pacific Islanders that are working on climate change, migration, and displacement. And I know that I'm saying that, we should look at mobility as a form of resilience. And while we need also to be grounded and remained in our land to be able to be resilient as well. And so it comes back to the conversations about land. And then while land is really important for the nurturing of identity and as a form of resilience, I'm proposing, or, just putting it out there, how do we navigate beyond this conversation and see mobility as a form of resilience with this in mind? Land is embodied in us. And so when we leave our home islands, we become an extension of the land. And so that's said a lot in a lot of the literature where Pacific Islands scholars write. And so how do we contextualize that in conversations around climate change, migration, and displacement? And it's not to dismiss the fact that land is very important for our resilience as Pacific Islanders, but also to try and open up the conversation to communities, diaspora communities, Pacific diaspora communities that are residing beyond the Pacific. How are they doing? How are they able to maintain their identity and traditions while being away? How are they seeing themselves grounded in relation to the land in which they've moved away? And I think I'm not saying that it's a fixed thing, but I'm proposing that this is some of the conversations that we should start having as well.
Okay.
And I'm sorry if I did not answer your question directly.
All right, next question. What did you learn from your interview with your respondents in the Solomon Islands?
I think it depends. I learned a lot. I think one of the things that I learned personally, like this whole documentation of this history, was also a journey for me in terms of my identity as someone who's the Gilbertese descent, who grew up in a cultural Gilbertese environment. And I think being in the Solomon Islands and not looking like a Solomon Islander, makes me wonder where I came from. And so this research or this study has really helped me in my journey in terms of really discovering who I am as a Gilbertese, and be able to take these stories and translate them into today's conversations around issues of identity, especially among young Pacific Islanders who are born and grew up outside of the Pacific, and be able to inform conversations around how do we navigate these contemporary spaces in terms of identity, in terms of being a Pacific Islander, whether it's being a Samoan, being a Tongan, being a Kiribati, being a Solomon Islander. I think that's, for me, was one of the main key important lessons that I learned. And the second thing is, when we look at the Western literature and, ways of doing research, I could have just stopped at the archival materials and write the story about the relocation. But I saw that it was really important to also hear from the people themselves about their experiences. And it's not to dismiss what has been written in the colonial archives, but really to bring these different conversations and perceptions of the relocation together and present it to whoever that's going to be interested in reading it, or whoever that will be working or who is working within this area, and say there are different stories to the relocation. And I think one of the important things is really privileging the voices of the people that were part of the relocation.
Got it. Next question. Do you think the overwhelming focus on climate migration in the Pacific these days obscure or helped highlight this complex history over land? And in that respect, how have you raised these nuances when you come up against policymakers and their decisions?
That's a very good question, but it's also a challenging one. And I think at different levels, there are different languages spoken. When you're working with policymakers, you speak the policy language. When you're working, especially in different contexts, regional, national, international as well, there's a different way of conveying things, and as well as the community. And sometimes it's never easy to speak up and highlight a lot of these issues because it's not the space for it. Or perhaps it needs to be raised somewhere else where it's nurturing, where when you speak of these issues are supported, they're nurtured, and they're brought to another space. And I think for me personally, I've worked across many spaces, and there are spaces that you feel that this is the right place to talk about these issues because we're all speaking the same language. And if I have to speak this in a different space that does not understand what I'm talking about, then it becomes pointless. It becomes pointless to talk about these things. And I think as we continue to navigate these spaces, and I think one of the platforms in which I'm allowed to speak about my work is this platform, and for which I can raise these issues or perhaps opportunities. And it's something not to dismiss other conversations, but it's something that I hope will build more conversation and interest into what we should be talking about.
Got it. Next question. What, if any, claims for compensation injuries have been made against British?
Oh, that's a hard one because we did try when I was in the Solomons, and I know that it's something that it's a bit challenging, and a lot of the people that were part of the relocation actually requested that justice be brought, that that we need to approach the British colonial or British government right now and outline our grievances. But it's one that's really challenging, and I know that there's a committee back home that is trying to navigate through this, but it's very hard when you have different perceptions of the relocation, and when you're seeing it just from one aspect. I think it'll be good if people that were involved in organizing this resettlement come together and sort of tease out what they were thinking at the time, and the Gilbertese people, how they were affected. But right now, we don't have that. And the conversations around getting justice for being displaced also lacks a lot of information and evidence. And I think that's one of the things that they were after, the evidence, especially in terms of ownership over Wagina Island, because they were promised more land when they left the Phoenix Islands. So that's a very challenging question, and also something that is not really being pursued right now by the younger generation or by the Gilbertese people.
Okay, got it. Next question. What kind of relationship exists between people in Wagina and their people that remain and descended in Kiribati?
So there's still relationships. they still maintain relationships from time to time. The Gilbertese people in the Solomon Islands travel to Kiribati to meet with their relatives. And especially a lot of them have really intermarried with they have spouses from the Kiribati Islands. And so over time, there's sort of like an exchange of families going there and then coming back to the Solomon Islands. And so they still maintain relationship, especially those that know they're part of the same kainga or extended family groupings. They still maintain their relationships. But in terms of land, they don't have land in Kiribati or in the Phoenix Islands. So that's what restricts them from really moving back.
Okay, got it. We have about 4 minutes left and we have 6 questions. So if you could be brief in the following questions, that would be great. Okay, next question. How do you see the struggle between China and the West in the Pacific Islands?
I'm not sure in terms of struggle, like that question perhaps can be redefined or refined a little bit in terms of the struggle. You can look at it at different perspectives. And I know that a lot of it is centered around the geopolitical relations and interaction within the region between China and the Pacific, specifically Solomon Islands and other Pacific Island countries. But I think I'm not sure if this is the space for us to talk about it. And I know that there are other people that are working more deeply into this. And so perhaps we could redirect the question to people that perhaps might have more information or insights to this.
Okay, next question. How did your research affect you personally, especially since your study is about your people?
I think it was transformational. It really transformed me as a person, not only in terms of my identity, but really learning to navigate between contemporary spaces, between different spaces. Growing up on Wagina Island, I only knew that I was from there, and like now venturing out, does not really, knowing who I am really helps in terms of navigating this contemporary spaces. And I'm really also grateful because I can use my experience to encourage other Pacific Islands people who are also finding it hard to navigate the spaces. As a Pacific Islander, as perhaps somebody from Fiji, from somewhere. And so it gives me that opportunity to really encourage them. But also one of the important things is really being the voice that your people expect of you. And so as a person who grew up in Wagina and as a Pacific Islander, I need to be speaking for the Pacific. I need to be speaking for the Pacific. As a woman, as a daughter of the Pacific, I need to be speaking for the Pacific. And I know oftentimes we're very passive about a lot of the issues that are raised within the Pacific or about the Pacific Islands. And it's because we're being respectful. But I think it's important also to carve our voices into these spaces so that we can speak on behalf of people that we perhaps represent in these new spaces, but also speak on behalf of the people. And I think I'm really fortunate that because of my research and because of great mentorship, and because of a lot of the Pacific Islands people that have met along my journey that have also encouraged me, but they've also sort of like encouraged me to encourage others. So I've really enjoyed this journey and wanted to continue to do that in the coming years.
Got it, thank you. We have 1 minute left and 3 questions, but I am optimistic that we can squeeze all of those questions into this session. So let's move on to the second question, the third question. And this question pertains to dreams and land. There has been research recently that looked at the relationship between dreams and land, particularly when rapture and displacement occurs. Have your people in your research, particularly youth, elder, or others, talked about how dreams are changing and thus reshaping people's relationship to place?
I am not in the capacity or also in the position to answer that question because I've not focused on it in my work. And so I do not have the right answers or insights to answer that question. So I apologize for that.
That's okay. Next question. Do the relocated Gilbertese identify as Solomon Islanders or Gilbertese?
So I'll use myself as an example. So I identify myself as a Solomon Islander, but also as a Gilbertese, as an Kiribati to some context. And I identify myself as a Gilbertese, and perhaps speaking on behalf of the other Gilbertese people, because that's the identity in which we're known for in the Solomon Islands. And so identity, like, you know, having a Solomon Islander identity and a Gilbertese is very situational. And so when I find myself in different situations, I identify myself differently as well. And in relation to people that ask me of my identity. And so, yeah, I am both a Solomon Islander and Kiribati, and of course I have Tuvaluan descent as well, so I can identify with that. So that would be the same with other Gilbertese in the Solomon Islands, unless they have ethnically have Chinese or other racial or ethnic relations, and they can identify to those as well.
Okay. Second to last question. You mentioned social capital and how people brought over their language, values, and beliefs to their new home. Were plants and animals from the original island ever transported to the new island?
No, unfortunately, no. A lot of people said that they had a lot of things that they wanted to bring on the boat, but because the relocation was done so swiftly that a lot of them left a lot of things on the beach before boarding the boat. So they only brought a few of the materials from their homes, but not a lot of things were left behind.
Okay, one last question. I don't think I've asked this question. Have you been able to consult with British archives on colonial history on the Gilbert Island? And if so, any particularly interesting findings?
To directly consult the British Colonial Administration, I have worked within the Western Pacific Archives, which is located in New Zealand, but I haven't been to the UK, to Britain, to consult the archival materials that they may have. And so perhaps that's one thing that I need to do down the road. But for now, a lot of my work are focused on a lot of the archival materials that have been documented or have been used within the Pacific Islands region.
Got it. Thank you very much. There's no more questions. Thank you again, Tammy, for sharing your fascinating insights on the relocation. And thank you to all our audience for joining us this afternoon. And this is it. I don't have an announcement for the next speaker. So have an awesome rest of the day, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Ponwin.